Hello! Some of the more under-recognized areas of the game development process, I think, or really any kind of skill-building journey in general, are things like reading, studying, and pondering. Of course, I think that's naturally because we tend to make videos about and share the things that are more maybe visually interesting or engaging. Because I mean, what am I gonna do? Film a video of me reading a book? Still, part of my goal with this channel is to share things about my game development process that you might not hear other channels talk about, including the marketing strategies and business plans for my games, as well as any failures, setbacks, or personal struggles that I might encounter as a solo developer. I think we tend to undervalue a lot of progress we make in our journeys when it's anything less than immediately visible or tangible, something that we feel is worth showing off. At least that's something that I have the habit of doing, and I'm trying to break that. All of this is to say that I've done a decent amount of reading for my project in these last few weeks since my last devlog. Game Programming Patterns is a nice handy handbook on game programming patterns that I picked up a couple of years back, and it's always nice to refresh the brain a little bit on some concepts I haven't put into practice in a while. It's also free through the author's website if you want to read it online, but I'm also just one of those people that prefers physical books. I also did a ton of reading on technical documentation that I'm not really going to share explicitly because, yeah, this actually is not that interesting to talk about, but it's this kind of ugly, less glamorous work that enables me to do the things that might be more interesting to look at and share, like the stuff you'll see later on in this video in regards to adding online multiplayer and some useful tools in architecture to my project, or I guess scaffolding at this point. In addition to that, however, I mentioned in my last devlog that I want to make comics and explore and build my universe a little bit outside of the game. Just have fun with it and find more ways that I can try to be creative and to make something that feels more expansive, I guess. So I also started reading this book by Scott McCloud called Making Comics. It itself is a comic book, and I really enjoyed this chapter on expressing emotions through the comic panels, and I really appreciated the technical details about how the different muscles in our faces are tied to certain expressions. So, as a bit of practice, I did a fair amount of doodling to try and find the style that I want to go for in my comics, and of course to just build some experience in creating convincing, accurate expressions. I think I did a pretty good job with Ollie here. Also, during this process, I thought it would be cool if each character had some kind of background story that you could learn about through the comics that I plan on scattering throughout the game. Of course, as your reward for watching these devlogs, you'll get to see a few of those comics in the future too. Here's a fun note, by the way. All the music in the first devlog and this video is music made by some of the composers that have reached out to work with me on this game. Because while I am doing all the art, animation, and programming myself, I'm also fucking dog shit at music composition and I cannot play any instruments. I have a few more character designs cooking that I'm excited to share with you guys soon, but I think after reading this book, I want to dedicate a whole video to my character design process in the near future. And with the nerdy stuff that I'm about to cover in this video, I think we can later just walk through creating and designing an entire character for my fighting game, from sketching, to modeling, to moveset design, to programming, and then of course, implementation. Anyways, for now, I think it's good to be reminded that not everything in life is sparkly, bright, and pretty. So let's get down and dirty with the nerdy, shall we? In my last devlog, I left off with a pretty rudimentary implementation of a state machine and input handling. Or in plain English, I made my characters animate and jump around. The purpose in doing this was ultimately to just test if my imagined way of programming things would actually work and to figure out if it would work cleanly, and in the long term prove not to be a giant pain in the ass as I add new characters, change animations, and tweak certain values to tune the look and feel of my game to where I eventually want it to be. My system worked pretty good from what I could tell, but I think it's also now a good time to talk about something I've been holding back on, and that's online multiplayer. With Rollback Netcode, again. So since I imagine not all of you come from a competitive fighting game background like I do, and I've been saying these buzzwords a lot, I'll try to explain Rollback pretty simply to the best of my own understanding. Rollback Netcode is essentially the golden standard for fighting games with online multiplayer these days. Basically, Rollback Netcode can make it feel like you're playing with someone offline. But how is that possible? Because information takes time to travel. And that's an undeniable principle that probably belongs to one of those laws of physics. I don't really know which one off the top of my head, but anyways, if you've ever experienced input delay in a game, that phenomenon where you press a button and it doesn't come out until a brief but noticeable time later, that's your computer compensating for the time it takes for information for the other players to reach you. If it takes, say, like 40 milliseconds for my controller inputs to reach your computer, then the game might wait about 40 milliseconds before processing your input so that our inputs reach the game at the same time, and our games will then remain synchronized. The worse our connection, or the farther the distance, the more time that our games need to wait, leading to even more input delay, and in the worst case, freezing when it actually takes longer for the expected inputs to be received. For reasons I'm sure I don't need to explain, this is awful for fighting games or really any type of game that requires fast reactions and precise control over your character, which is why in the last few years, many fighting games have abandoned this type of netcode, usually known as delay-based or lockstep, in favor of rollback. Since fighting game players are also a special breed of picky, demanding freaks, Super Smash Bros. Melee, a now 23-year-old game, even had rollback added to it through the efforts of its community, and games like Street Fighter V and Dragon Ball FighterZ were overhauled by their developers to use rollback instead, which is definitely no easy task. But it's worth it, because we really, really want a good online experience when it comes to fighting games. So how is it possible for rollback netcode to break the laws of physics, to ignore the time it takes for input to be received so that it feels like we're playing offline? Well, it's not breaking any laws of physics, obviously, it's all just basically a magic trick. Instead of forcing our games to remain in sync by freezing whenever we have to wait for an input, our games will actually allow themselves to be momentarily desynchronized. But when we do finally get those inputs that we are still waiting for, or if our game states end up being too different, we go back in time to when we were last actually in sync, and then the game simulates forward, however long that time difference was, all within one frame of real-world time. And by the way, in fighting games, a frame, or tick, is usually 1/60th of a second, or 16.7 milliseconds. This is also the rate where all those important physics and simulation calculations and things like that are being done. Essentially, that means when our games resynchronize, everything teleports or interpolates to where it should be. Another name you might hear for this type of netcode is predictive, and that's because for the sake of efficiency, our games will also try to assume whatever the other player's inputs are on each frame. And if that assumption was right, then there's no reason to force a resynchronization. Predictive, by the way, sounds a little more sophisticated than it really is, because oftentimes it's just assumed that the other player's inputs are the same as they were on the previous frame, and that happens to be good enough in a lot of cases. I'm especially a pretty picky freak when it comes to delay, and rollback netcode makes it so that a connection that might have even like 5 to 8 frames of input delay, or roughly like 83 to 133 milliseconds of latency, is actually playable. And more often than not, the teleporting that I described isn't really noticeable in the moment. That's because sometimes the differences in position or game states can be so slight that you won't even see it with the naked eye. There's a lot of challenges that come with implementing rollback netcode, however, and I mentioned how the game has to be capable of going back in time, which means you need to come up with how to store and restore all of the necessary information for your game to go back to, and then how to actually execute the simulation forward to the present. This means, in part, finding a way to strip down the information that's being stored so that you're not doing anything that's not strictly necessary for calculating the game state, which can maybe be more simply put as there's no point in running animations and sound effects and things like that when no one's going to experience them. Two computers doing the same calculations on things like physics can also come to slightly different conclusions due to a problem known as floating point error, where, because of hardware limitations, basically, non-integers aren't actually typically calculated or stored with perfect accuracy. This means over time our simulations will drift away from each other due to compounding differences in values. And there's still a few more issues that I haven't and won't touch on because as a solo developer, I have exactly one lifetime's worth of learning and exactly one person's worth of labor and effort, and I also have deadlines. So fuck all that, I'm using Photon Quantum, a third-party extension to the Unity engine, because it's going to deal with all that shit for me. If y'all know about a little game called Nickelodeon All-Star Brawl 2, you might know that this is the same solution that was used by the developers to add rollback netcode. I'm not really totally off the hook yet though, because I do still have to play nice with all of the actual structural differences that Photon Quantum imposes when using it with Unity. For example, I guess, the component system is very different. There's things called systems that will handle entities that have specific components attached to them, and all changes to the simulation need to be done within these systems with respect to each simulation frame, or tick, basically. The data that gets modified within these ticks is the data that will keep players synchronized. It's the important stuff that tells us how our games are actually different. And it's this data that will be used during game state restoration, in other words, during rollbacks. I can't attach a mono behavior script and start moving things around like you might expect to in a normal Unity project, because that behavior happens outside of the context of the frames that store all of that game state information. But this is also how I can handle animations and UI stuff, since those things don't affect the game state necessarily. So, while I don't have to make my own implementation for restoring game states and simulating forward or having deterministic math, I do have to respect the architecture set up by Photon Quantum and use their systems. This is also why I mentioned I had to throw out all of my code in the last devlog and do it again. And here, I've done it already, actually. The project isn't as pretty as the last version because I'll deal shaders later, but yeah, I've translated all of the logic to Photon Quantum. My main challenge so far has been figuring out how to translate the state machine, but I did so using Photon Quantum's equivalent of scriptable objects known as asset objects. I'll skip over most of the nitty-gritty detail here because you can check out the last devlog if you missed it, but if we look at my movement system class, which really should be renamed to state system or something like that at this point, you can see some parts where, although the logic looks very similar, keep in mind that since components themselves don't have any behavior, everything needs to be programmed to basically handle a generic case where the data is independent of the system, if that makes sense. Asset objects are where I define what a character state is and all the behavior that each state can exhibit. And in this case, things are actually extremely similar to how they were implemented in my non-Photon version of the game. I'm also now no longer creating and destroying states, but instead finding the state behavior through essentially a global reference in the asset object files, which I think is probably better for performance. If you want to dig into Photon Quantum on a deeper level than I've explained, you can check it out for yourself through the link I threw in the description. Because now let's talk about the actually really important thing here, which is how do I make online multiplayer work now? Well, here's the cool thing. It was there all along. When you adhere to the rules of Photon Quantum's architecture, online multiplayer kind of just works. Of course, there's a whole lot more to that, and there's a whole lot more that I need to do besides just add a couple characters to a scene so that they can walk around. But look, I can get 2 instances of the game running and connecting to a server that's hosted away from my computer. And I did all this without actually doing any networking programming at all. So, cool, I spent like, 4 weeks since the last devlog doing just this and reading some books? No. I did not. I spent like a week doing this, got preoccupied with moving again, and then nearly blew my fucking brains out trying to drill cat furniture into a wall, and then I had to do some traveling for important adult stuff. And in between all that, I worked on something I think actually is really cool and will save me a shitload of time. A hitbox editor. I think development tools are also an underrated aspect of game development. And I mean, like, yeah, it also makes sense because you're not technically working directly on the game. You're not doing anything that looks fancy or anything that can be shown off and impress the random people in your life, right? At least the ones who might only be able to understand things like art and gameplay. But again, by doing this boring, I guess, kind of stuff, I'm able to do the cooler things a lot more efficiently. So this thing is still in need of some polish, but I'm actually very happy with how it's coming together so far, given that this was my first time really trying to put together a custom editor window, my first time getting this deep into JSON serialization, and it was also a unique challenge in doing both through the pretty unfamiliar lens of Photon Quantum. So designing hitboxes can be a bit of a challenge, especially since I'm not really allowed to attach simulation altering logic to my animations. In other words, I don't think I can just use the Unity animator and spawn in or move hitboxes like you otherwise might do outside of Quantum. So here's my solution instead. First thing is I'll make a JSON file with a name structure of character name underscore hitbox data, which will be discovered by my hitbox editor when I open its window. This gives me a list of every character I've added according to the existing files, and I can access whatever data I've decided will exist through those files. I don't know if I've expressed my fundamental disdain for using the animator as a state machine before, but one thing this piece of shit is actually good for is just storing the names of every state that I have on a character. Whenever I import my character models, their animations and their names are brought with them, and then I can grab a list of those animations and use their names to populate this drop-down list. If there's any data already in the JSON file, then it'll be bound to the animation state with the matching tag, and if not, I can just create new data through this editor that will be saved to the file for later reference. The window also grabs a character object that's named Dummy, as well as the main camera to set up this convenient view for me on the side. Eventually, I actually want these to be instantiated in a preview scene so that I, 1, don't have to have objects by those names in the scene, and 2, don't accidentally actually modify a real scene in any unintended way. Once I choose a character and the state that I want to modify the data for, I can use the slider that will let me pick which animation frame I want to operate on. If any hitboxes exist on that frame, they're going to show up in this list, and I can also add or delete hitboxes from here too. There's a lot of different values that might exist on a hitbox that I haven't implemented here, but some important ones are their positional offset relative to the character, when the hitbox is meant to appear, and of course when the hitbox is meant to disappear, and if I want the hitbox to interpolate. Interpolation basically just means instead of being a teleporting sphere, the hitbox will be a capsule that connects the previous and current positions. While I'm editing these hitboxes, I'll also get to see a visual representation of them in the view that I created. Also, if I change the startup or end values, the editor dynamically updates each frame to match. So I made everything really easy for myself here, and I'm very happy with how it's come out. Everything is also set up in a way that, for the computer science nerds, grabbing hitbox data has a search time of O of 1, which basically means that whenever I need to get hitbox data to create a hitbox, it happens instantly. When I save this data, it gets serialized for permanent storage and also converted into a series of dictionaries on a hitbox config file, which can be accessed during runtime as a basically globally accessible scriptable object. So each frame, I can just check if the dictionary contains a value for my character, the state I'm in, and then the animation frame that our character is on. So the data for all of the hitboxes that exist on the 12th frame of Ollie's forward air can be found by keying into the dictionary like this. And then once we have that data, we can just create a hitbox from it. I kind of just glossed over the details here and condensed like 3 days worth of programming into 3 minutes. But yeah, to reemphasize my earlier point, the ugly stuff is hard to show in an interesting way sometimes. I had to work through a ton of bugs, and after getting it to a state that looks nearly identical to how it is right now, I pretty much rewrote everything from the serialization to the UI in a way that was much more clean and easier for me to change in the future. At this stage in development, especially with such a distant goal for release, I think that investing my time super hard upfront into making things easy to update and creating tools like this that will pay off super hard in the long run because of the time that'll save is a good decision. Since all of this hitbox data is also serialized and passed through code each time it's modified, I could write some additional code to write out patch notes between versions of my game so that I don't have to keep track of things manually, and I could also expand this editor to let me modify my character's hurt boxes during the animation too. And then I'll have super precise control over every detail of my game without also needing to spend a ton of time staring at and changing those tiny details manually. Or at least changing those details in a manual way that's not so user-friendly for myself. It also makes the data resistant to change so that if I alter anything that I actually want on my hitbox data, I don't accidentally nuke all of my files. And I can also store backups. I still have some more artsy stuff to show off, but at this point we've hit the end of the progress I've made on the programming side of this project before I go to PAX in a few days. So as a side note, look out for a video on that where I'll be trying out the Kirby Air Riders demo and where I'll also get to finally, for the first time in person, see the project I was working on during my internship at NASA in person. The logo that you see in the thumbnail of this video was actually designed by my sister's husband, who works as a graphic designer. We did a little bit of back and forth, and this is the very rough draft that I threw back to him. That is not the final version, but we're getting pretty close to it, I think. And the original version of this logo I got was dope too. It was clean, and I was pretty happy with it already, but I figured it would be fun to try to incorporate more elements relevant to the game and its theme. So my modifications here include some pretty drastic changes to the silhouette and the addition of a tire, a tow truck cable, and hook. This also kind of incidentally inspired some interesting ideas that I have for one of the characters I've designed who also doesn't have a name yet. Shrimp Man, as he's known right now, has claws, obviously, and I thought they looked really similar to the towing hook that I drew on the logo. I already kind of planned on him being an antagonist, so I was like, you know what if he's the owner of the towing company that impounded Ollie's car? And then also, what if his hook was actually like tied to a chain that extends and retracts and like maybe whips around? Since the characters in my game exist in a relatively realistic setting, I've been feeling a little limited in the concepts I can include in my designs and the archetypes I've been able to explore, but this seemed like a great opportunity to try to spice things up. This also is a good opportunity to talk about some of the fun ways that I've been trying to collaborate with people I know for this project. To put it simply, I think it's just cool to be able to invite friends and family onto this thing because, I don't know, like it makes the project feel more alive or more like a community effort. And that's also why I like taking suggestions for character names, and it's really fun to see how you guys interpret their designs and what kind of moves you might expect them to see. So on that note, feel absolutely free to throw out suggestions or ideas because I always read every comment that I get, and I might really like your idea and I could bring it to life and immortalize it in the game. I haven't gotten around to doing this yet, but I have a friend who after high school started working on his own clothing brand, and I wanted to integrate his clothing designs into my character designs. I alluded to this in the last devlog where I mentioned I had some plans to give Cool Frog a makeover. Still haven't chosen a name yet, by the way, and really I wanted to throw in some of my friend's clothing. I still probably have a whole video's worth of content on just redesigning my characters and trying to standardize some things, because the main issue I have right now, honestly, is just that each of my characters has very different texture resolutions, and I think I also want to figure out an approach to animating their faces to make them a little more expressive in-game. Oh, and while I was talking, I was just whipping up a business card, because I've never actually really made one before, and I thought it'd be fun to have for PAX if I meet people and they happen to be curious about my project. So that wraps up everything for today. Thank you guys for watching and for being patient in between these updates. The support has been very overwhelming so far, and I'm actually very happy to see that some people are already excited about this little passion project of mine. And if you haven't subscribed already, please go ahead and do so, show some support, and also throw a follow at me on Instagram too, because I gotta market my content and make some videos over there too at some point. So, bye!